Hello. I thought I'd make a quick response video to Big Joel. He released a video called "We Don't Talk About Donald Trump," and I thought I'd throw a few points out there for your consideration. I liked where you're going with your video when the whole idea is we don't talk about Donald Trump, right? We're not actually talking about the person, we're talking about our projection onto him, and that projection stems from things that we value as people. So if, say, you, as you pointed out, stopping illegal immigration is important or the economy is important, you would see, you're more willing to believe what he says about not wanting to create a panic when he downplays the threat of the virus. But if you believe in protecting people, and particularly the vulnerable, so you have the elderly, people whose immune systems are compromised, then you're going to project that on the Donald Trump and be like, I don't believe him when he says that. Or as you say, it doesn't really matter whether he really believed that lie or not. You argue that it got people killed. And so I think that's a very good point. But where you lose me is, it's interesting because you're saying, you're pointing this out, but then you proceed to do that very exact thing by claiming that Donald Trump's actions, or lack thereof, downplaying the virus and not having like a more overt national response to it, that ended up, as you claimed, murdering hundreds of thousands of Americans. Well, interesting. Here's the best way I can put it. Let's look at like what's happening around the world. Around the world, this virus, everywhere it's gone, it's caused a lot of problems. With the exception of some of the, places like Japan seem to be doing pretty well with it. But I mean, any Western European country has been just destroyed by this. I mean, you have lots of people getting sick and hospitalized, dying, and all of them, everywhere you go, has implemented large lockdown measures. People stayed home. The businesses were closed. Gatherings were shut down. People wore these masks and such, and still, the virus did a lot of damage. And so, let's say that the virus did about this much damage, right? It did a certain amount of. It was a catastrophe. It did a certain amount of damage, and when you don't have much of a response, as Donald Trump did, he downplayed it. He didn't really. He harped more on he criticized the effects of the lockdown on the economy and everything. That's it. That's one of his big points. But so he didn't really do as much in terms of the lockdown. He didn't institute a national one. He left it up to the states. When this happens, all this destruction, and then the elected officials' response is not very overt. People blame you. That's who gets blamed. You're the cause of this destruction from the virus. But if you do what Cuomo did in New York, and you have a very drastic response, or in other countries like China was praised for the response to coronavirus, and they are very drastic with their lockdown measures. And so if you're up here and the virus does all the damage, they don't blame you because you did everything you could. That's how people see it. They blame the virus. Wow. And they even justify it. So the fact that you did all this, even if it wasn't effective, even if everywhere it was tried, this still happened. They blame that. They see you as innocent. You did everything you could. And therein lies the issue. So Donald Trump's a murderer, that he murdered people because he did this. But my point is that whether you do this, that, basically the same result everywhere you go. People get sick and died, mainly elderly people. I believe I heard once that 50% of the deaths from coronavirus are people over 80 years old. You look at Sweden. Sweden's response was pretty light, and they had the same issues that everywhere else had. So that's that's one of the points I really wanted to get at, and both a factual correction on what you're saying in your video, or just maybe adding more context, and also kind of taking what you're saying a little bit further, because I think you're doing the same thing that CNN reporter is doing, that those Trump supporters are doing. You're projecting your values on Trump. You want to protect the vulnerable. I can sense that you're more liberal. I'm also very liberal, but I'm also very conservative. In that that's a whole other thing to get into. But liberals tend to believe in protecting the vulnerable, and protecting the vulnerable is a huge part of that. Well, in this case, I'm just going to point out that the lockdowns didn't work. The mask didn't work. It didn't succeed in protecting the vulnerable. And so, unfortunately, as much as people are devastated by this, as much as people are heartbroken over this and just what's happened, you really can't blame this one on Trump to a significant extent. Even though he might be a target for that grief from people, because he wasn't, you could say, acting, and once again, you could project this onto him, like he wasn't acting in the best faith. A good person, you could say, is someone who would, oh, of course I'll wear the mask. Oh, of course I'll stay home. Oh, of course I'm not going to, anything, please just tell me what to do if it means protecting people, and I will do it. And there's people who didn't do that. My point is that it didn't really matter, unfortunately. That's the unfortunate truth, is that people were going to die anyways. I'm not saying there's nothing that could have been done about it. I'm not saying that we should have done nothing about it. It's just the unfortunate truth is the things that were thought people would think would work, the lockdowns and the masks, did not work. And they also carry with them a lot of consequences. And then one last thing I want to point out here. I'm going to leave a link to this in the description. It's a link to a paper by Denis Rancourt called Masks Don't Work. And it's a review of all these different studies on mask usage. And what's key here is that they are randomized controlled trials. And what that means is that, from what I understand, at least, you have one group of people wearing masks and you have another group of people not wearing masks, and they go through basically an identical, or at least the closest you can to an identical experience, say working with sick patients at a hospital and such, and finding out how the rate of each group getting infected with respiratory illnesses, which that's what COVID-19 is. It's a respiratory flu. It functions, at least in terms of transmission, basically the same way as any other respiratory illness, a respiratory viral illness, right? And all these trials involving tens of thousands of people, all of them randomized, which is different from what these establishment media outlets are telling you. It's all inconclusive. They can't. It's like the numbers are so small, the difference of people getting sick, that it's negligible. And effectively, you really can't take anything else away from that, but besides, masks don't work. They don't. It's been tested thoroughly. Interestingly enough, though, these are all studies from before 2020. So these were in 2010, 2011 and such. Interesting how, just like that, all the research that was available on masks and their role in potentially stopping the transmission of a respiratory viral illness, they were all inconclusive and just had there's no proof of it working. And then suddenly in 2020, there's all this research that comes out. They do work. Pieces of fabric you could put over your face that have been around for a long time, and it had a commonly agreed upon usage in the medical field, now suddenly have been proven right around the time COVID-19 comes out to work. So that's an interesting piece of science to look into. As always, thank you for watching. Have a good night.